Hey everyone, it's your guy coming at you with another deep dive into something that's been happening right under our noses. And I promise, by the time we're done, you're going to look at every Japanese branded TV, fridge, or car in a totally different light. On January 20th, 2026, a single announcement sent shockwaves through the global consumer electronics world. Sony, the same Sony that once had the entire planet craning their necks at those gorgeous Trinitron CRT screens, the absolute gold standard of high-end televisions, suddenly announced it was packing up its home entertainment business, including its crown jewel brand, Bravia, and handing it over to someone else. And that someone isn't Samsung, isn't LG, isn't some American tech giant. The buyer is a Chinese company called TCL. And we're not talking about a little passive investment here or some friendly tech sharing handshake. We are talking about control. TCL walked away with 51% of the new joint venture. Sony kept just 49%. By the end of March, both sides had signed the final agreement. The new company's headquarters will still be in Tokyo. The giant Sony logo will still be plastered on the front of the products, but the hand that's actually gripping the steering wheel, calling the shots, making the big decisions, that hand is no longer in Japan. But here's where it really stings. After this alliance locks in, China's combined share of the global television market is about to surpass Samsung and take the #1 spot worldwide. Let that sink in. The Financial Times, that snooty British paper, ran this snarky little line saying Sony might as well just rename itself Tony. Now, and don't laugh that off as a joke, this isn't some internet meme. This is real. It's happening right now. And it tells you everything about how the tectonic plates of global manufacturing have shifted while most of us weren't paying attention. And then you have the others: Toshiba, Sanyo, Sharpneck, Fujitsu. These are names you grew up hearing. Names that felt like sacred totems of Japanese industry. The face of made in Japan during its golden age. The very definition of craftsmanship and quality that got written into business school case studies. But if you went and checked their corporate family registries today, you'd find something that makes your skin crawl. A significant number of them don't have Japanese last names anymore. Some now go by Hair, some by Midea, some by Hisense, some by Lenovo, some by Changhong. And the newest one at the back of that very long line now goes by TCL. They just haven't been shouting it from the rooftops. But the quiet truth is, by the way, I'm Chinese now. So today, we're peeling back the curtain on this silent revolution. No gunfire, no breaking news banners, no parades, but a sweeping, methodical rewrite of half of Japan's manufacturing legacy. And as usual, before we really get into the meat of it, let's lay a few things on the table for you. A white goods giant that bled red ink for 9 straight years, a 100-year-old empire hollowed out by accounting fraud. Eventually privatized and taken off the stock market by its own people, a purchase price that got slashed in half at the 11th hour. A television business so deep in debt that analysts openly called it financial garbage. And a number that'll give you chills, 74. On top of all that, we've got a car headquarters building bought up by Chinese money, a business that even Japanese people can't avoid after they die. And the most counterintuitive twist of all, these Japanese brands, after being taken over by Chinese companies, didn't shrivel up and die. They actually came back to life, and in some cases, they're more vibrant than before. But before we get into the buyouts, let's take a minute to get one thing straight. Just how untouchable, how legendary Made in Japan used to be. Rewind the clock to the 1970s and 80s. That was Japan's industrial god-tier era. You had Sony Walkmans hanging off the hips of young people everywhere. Toshiba CRTs sitting proudly in American and European living rooms. Sanyo batteries powering everything. Sharp calculators on every desk. Panasonic VCRs in every household. Hitachi air conditioners humming away. Back in those days, if it had a Made in Japan sticker on it, you could automatically jack up the price by 20 or 30%, and people around the world would still fight each other to buy it. The Japanese called it craftsmanship. They called their nation manufacturing first. That was the era they proudly dubbed the light of Japan. And the brightest, most brilliant beam in that light, Toshiba. How old is Toshiba? Founded in 1875. We're talking over a century and a half of industrial history. Its tentacles stretched across home appliances, semiconductors, heavy machinery, energy, and infrastructure. At one point, it was Japan's biggest semiconductor maker and one of the largest personal computer manufacturers on Earth. Even the flash memory chips we all take for granted today in our phones and laptops. Toshiba invented them. The name Toshiba was essentially the face of Japanese manufacturing power. So hold that image of a light in your mind, because next we're about to watch it flicker, dim, and go out piece by piece. In slow motion cracks. as they often do, begin where you least expect them. Take Sanyo. It was once a top-tier white goods player. Washing machines, refrigerators, batteries. They were all legit and respected, but once the new millennium hit, losses piled up year after year for 9 straight years. Eventually, even Panasonic couldn't stand watching the train wreck anymore and brought them in-house. But a hot potato is still a hot potato. Panasonic couldn't digest it either. So they put the whole business up for sale. The real buyer from Qingdao, China. In 2011, Haier stepped in with roughly 10 billion yen, that's about 100 million US dollars, to buy Sanyo's refrigerator and washing machine operations in Japan, Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines, and Malaysia. That included Rand, production, and sales, lock, stock, and barrel. And they also walked away with the brand Aqua, which was a Sanyo sublabel for washing machines with pure, undiluted Japanese bloodlines. But from that year onward, its birthplace on paper was quietly changed to Haier. Haier didn't erase the Aqua name. Instead, they ran a dual brand strategy in Japan, pushing their own Haier name while still using the Aqua banner. Later, they set up their Asian headquarters in Osaka, built Rand centers, and opened new plants right there in Japan. So far, this just sounds like another cross-border Mana deal, but here's where it gets really weird. A discarded brand, by all logic, should sink into obscurity and slowly fade away. But reality decided to do the exact opposite after Haier took over. Aqua's market share in washing machines kept climbing. In some years, they actually overtook Panasonic and Sharp. Right there in Japan itself, on its home turf, it sold better than the homegrown Japanese brands. How insane is that? A Chinese-owned brand with a Japanese-sounding name runs into Japan and starts beating Japanese stalwarts at their own game. That's not a takeover, that's a lesson in how to flip a brand. If Sanyo was just the appetizer, then the next one cut right into the backbone of Japanese manufacturing, the main character again, Toshiba. In 2015, a scandal blew up that shook Japan to its core, accounting fraud. And we're not talking about some minor book cooking, we're talking about fake profits amounting to over 1 billion US dollars. The stock market reacted like someone had pulled the rug out. The stock tanked, market value evaporated by 40% overnight, and half the board of directors, including the president himself, resigned in disgrace. That century-old light of Japan got dragged through the mud, and the entire country watched in horror. But the fraud was just the opening act. The real death blow was what Toshiba had bet the entire farm on: nuclear power. They went all in, buying Westinghouse Electric in the United States for a fortune, hoping to ride the nuclear energy wave to even greater glory. Then came the Fukushima disaster in 2011, and here's the bitter, tragic irony. Toshiba was actually involved in the original design and construction of the Fukushima Daiichi plant. They made their name in nuclear power, and they ended up being ruined by it. Westinghouse turned into a bottomless pit of losses that kept sucking money in. In one fiscal year alone, Toshiba projected losses approaching 750 billion yen. That's enough to sink a 100-year-old industrial giant. With its back against the wall, Toshiba had to start hacking off chunks of itself just to survive. The first piece they put on the chopping block, white goods, in 2016, Toshiba sold 80.1% of its appliance subsidiary, Toshiba Lifestyle Products and Services Corporation, to Midea, based in Shunde, Guangdong, China. The price tag, roughly 50 billion yen, which is about 500 million US dollars. Toshiba kept less than 20%. What did Midea get for that money? Way more than just a factory and a few assembly lines. They got a 40-year global license to use the Toshiba brand, and over 5,000 core patents related to white goods technology. In other words, from that day forward, if you walk into a Best Buy or any other store and see a Toshiba refrigerator or washing machine, legally and financially, more than 80% of that product no longer belongs to Tokyo. It belongs to Midea, a Chinese company based in Guangdong. At this point, you're probably sitting there thinking, Sanyo lost money for years. Toshiba lost money. Why the hell are Chinese companies rushing to buy these sinking ships? Are they just signing up to be Japanese bailout patsies throwing good money after bad? But hold on, because we're about to do a 180-degree turn, that'll make your head spin. Check out the scorecard after Midea took over Toshiba's appliance business. Before the buyout, it was an albatross around Toshiba's neck, bleeding cash every quarter. After Midea took over, by 2017, revenue hit roughly 250 billion yen. That's a 50% jump from its final years under Toshiba. By 2018, it was actually turning a profit. And here's the kicker that nobody expected: Midea didn't clean house. They didn't fire everyone and bring in Chinese managers. Most of the Japanese workers stayed. The Japanese factories stayed, the Toshiba name stayed right there on the products. The only thing that changed was the invisible surname on the ownership papers. So I ask you, who exactly saved whom here? And that's when the counterintuitive truth starts screaming at you from every direction. These so-called Chinese rescuers weren't there to pick over carcasses and strip assets. They were there to save lives, to inject cash and management discipline into dying brands. And they did it over and over again. Next came Toshiba's television business. At the end of 2017, Hisense suddenly announced it was buying 95% of Toshiba's TV subsidiary, known as TVs. Sounds great on paper, right? Until you actually look at the financials. Liabilities exceeded assets. The company was technically insolvent, deep in the red. Industry analysts openly called it a ticking time bomb that would drag Hisense down with it. And check this detail out. Initial negotiations put the price at 12.9 billion yen. But by the time the ink was dry on the final contract, the price had been slashed in half, just 5.985 billion yen. Think about the symbolism there. A once iconic Japanese television brand sold at a 50% discount, including a 40-year global brand license, into the hands of Hisense in Qingdao. Remember that old advertising slogan, the new generation of Toshiba? Well, now the folks running that new generation Toshiba speak Mandarin. And Hisense had already taken over Sharp's North American TV business back in 2015. They knew exactly what they were doing and how to play this game. Why on earth would Hisense buy a financial grenade like that? It's actually not complicated. They weren't buying a balance sheet. They were buying the 40-year global brand passport, that is the Toshiba name. They were buying decades of accumulated expertise in image processing chips and picture quality algorithms. And more than anything else, they were buying a golden ticket to get Chinese-made televisions into American and European living rooms legitimately with a trusted brand name already on the box. Hisense didn't want Toshiba's troubled past. They wanted Toshiba's future potential repurposed for their own global ambitions. But the story doesn't stop there. Because Toshiba wasn't the only titan taking a dive. Zoom out and you'll see an entire forest of Japanese industrial giants falling one after another. Nii's personal computer business, 90% of it went to Lenovo in 2011. Fujitsu, another old-school Japanese PC heavyweight, sold over half of its personal computer business to Lenovo in 2018. Sanyo's television business went to Changhong, a Chinese state-owned enterprise. And Sharp, with over a century of panel-making history and some of the most advanced LCD technology on the planet, ended up selling 66% of itself to Taiwan's Hanhai, better known to Americans as Foxconn, in 2016 for roughly 388.8 billion yen. And Foxconn didn't get that one easily. Terry Gou personally spent 4 years negotiating, with Samsung circling like a shark and the Japanese government desperate to keep the century-old brand and core display technology from leaving the country. But at the end of the day, Sharp's increasingly gaping financial hole made the decision for them. That deal set a record at the time for the largest foreign acquisition of a Japanese technology company ever. When you string those names together in a row, Toshiba, Sanyo, SharpNeck, Fujitsu, this isn't just a few isolated Manda deals. This is an entire generation of Japanese manufacturing power taking a collective bow and walking off the global stage, and catching them as they fall hair Midea, Hisense, Lenovo, Changhong. And here's where it gets really interesting from an American perspective. Back when Chinese appliance brands first wanted to go global, the biggest barriers they faced were technology gaps, patent thickets, and a brand name that nobody in America or Europe recognized. And guess what they got in these buyouts? Midea walked away with over 5,000 Toshiba patents. Hisense got decades of Toshiba's picture quality and processing expertise. Lenovo grabbed Japan's entire personal computer production line and engineering talent. In other words, Chinese companies didn't just buy brands, they bought the very industrial arsenal that Japan had spent half a century building, and they turned it into ammunition for their own global expansion. This was never really about a few business deals. This was and is a silent, methodical, colossal transfer of industrial power from one Asian giant to another. So let's ask the same question again. How did Sharp do after the Foxconn takeover? I think you already know the answer by now. Before Foxconn stepped in, Sharp was losing over 200 billion yen a year, literally on the verge of bankruptcy and collapse. The first fiscal year after Foxconn took over, losses shrank by about 90%. The next fiscal year, net profit turned positive over 70 billion yen in the black. That was Sharp's first taste of profitability in 4 long, painful years. Same ending. A Japanese brand hanging by a thread, revived by Chinese and Taiwanese capital. To be fair, some critics in Japan said Foxconn went too cheap on pricing and damaged the Sharp brand's premium image. That debate will go on for years. But the balance sheet going from bright red to solid black, that's undeniable, and it's the kind of thing that makes American business school professors sit up and take notes. And so, quietly, a phrase started circulating in Japanese industry circles: Chinese money saves Japanese companies. Those 6 words sound like a rallying cry for China. But when you place them under the microscope of Japan's manufacturing legacy, you taste something profoundly bitter. Because it means that the country that once taught the rest of the world how to build quality products now relies on a Chinese manufacturing sector that it probably looked down on just a generation ago to keep itself breathing. Now, you might think this is just about home appliances and consumer electronics, and you might say, well, Japan doesn't even care about that stuff anymore. They've moved on to more advanced industries, but next comes Japan's real lifeline, the one that truly hurts: automobiles. This industry accounts for nearly 40% of Japan's entire manufacturing output. The Japanese themselves call it their national fate, their economic crown jewel. Back in the 1980s and 90s, the United States tried everything: voluntary export restraints, tariffs, trade wars, to hold back Japanese car imports, and we managed to choke off some sectors. But we never could fully stop Japanese cars from rolling across American highways. Then in November 2025, a news item dropped that made the entire country wince: Nissan, the maker of the legendary GTR sports car, one of the most iconic names in automotive history, sold its global headquarters building in Yokohama. The price, about 97 billion yen, which works out to roughly 4 billion US dollars. The buyer, a consortium led by a Chinese auto parts giant listed in Hong Kong called Mint Group. And here's the tragicomic detail that makes it hurt even more: after selling the building, Nissan signed a 20-year lease with the new Chinese owner to keep working out of the exact same building, the one that no longer bears their name on the deed. A company that helped lift an entire devastated nation into the ranks of the developed world, now reduced to renting office space from its Chinese landlord just to catch its breath and keep the lights on. And it's not just a building. Back in 2021, Hisense, the same Qingdao-based company we just talked about, quietly pulled off something even more ruthless. They spent well over $1 billion US to acquire about 75% of the voting rights in a Japanese company called Sanyo Holdings. That company happens to be one of the world's top suppliers of automotive air conditioning compressors. You know, that cool breeze hitting your face when you sit in a Japanese car on a hot summer day. A big chunk of the technology behind that breeze had already changed nationality without you even knowing it. And if you think selling headquarters buildings and AC compressors is wild enough, get this: Chinese capital actually reached into something you'd never guess in a million years: the Japanese funeral and cremation business. Japan's cremation rate is an astonishing 99.7%. Almost everyone gets cremated. Most crematoriums across the country are run by local governments, with one major exception: Tokyo. The Tokyo metropolitan area has 9 crematoriums, 7 of which are privately run, and 6 of those 7 are controlled by the exact same company, Tokyo Bosen. That one company handles nearly 70% of all cremations in Tokyo's 23 wards. And according to multiple Japanese media reports that have been widely covered starting around 2022, the single biggest shareholder pulling the strings behind Tokyo Bosen had quietly become Chinese capital. Think about the incredible reach of that. Even former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's final journey, his cremation, went through one of their facilities. Let that sink in for a moment. An average Japanese person working their entire life using Chinese-made appliances at home, sitting in a car with a Chinese-made air conditioning system. And at the very end of the road, even that final passage through the flames goes through Chinese-controlled hands. One Japanese netizen summed it up with bitter humor: "We can't even die purely Japanese anymore." When reporters pressed Tokyo Bosen on price hikes, they blamed rising fuel and labor costs. Nothing to do with foreign ownership, they insisted. You believe that I'll let you decide by now? You're probably sitting there asking, how did Japanese manufacturing, once so absolutely invincible, get to a point where it needs outsiders just to keep breathing? And that's the real core of the whole story, the part that matters most. The first cut was made by the very thing they prided themselves on most: their famous craftsmanship. While the rest of the world, especially the Americans and Koreans, was chasing value for money, rapid iteration, and economies of scale. Japanese companies were still obsessing over microscopic details that nobody but a handful of engineers could even notice. They were burning cost and time on things regular consumers never even saw, let alone appreciated. Great products? Absolutely, but they priced themselves out of the mass market. Second, cut, transformation, and speed. As television displays went from bulky CRTs to liquid crystal to OLEDs to everything else, Korean giants like Samsung and LG, along with aggressive Chinese panel makers, rushed in with massive cash, enormous production capacity, and brutal price wars. The slow-moving, consensus-driven Japanese giants were still hesitating, still holding endless meetings. By the time they finally woke up and decided to act, half the global market had already been carved up and taken away. Third cut, and this is the deepest one of all, came from within their own corporate culture. Toshiba's accounting fraud wasn't just one rogue executive's mistake. It was a systemic, generational cancer, hiding bad news, papering over cracks, promoting people who kept quiet, and firing those who spoke up layer after layer of self-deception. Until the dam finally broke and the hole was so big that nobody could patch it, big ships turned slowly, old bureaucratic organizations struggle to reform themselves from the inside. That's the real painful reason why the light of Japan slowly, inexorably went dim, and you think that's the end of the story. Not even close. The most heartbreaking cinematic scene is the fate of that very light itself. Let's go back one more time to Toshiba. They sold appliances, sold televisions, sold laptops, sold medical equipment. Piece by painful piece, they dismantled their own empire, auctioning off the family silver to stay alive. In the end, even the hollowed-out corporate shell couldn't survive on its own. In 2023, a consortium of over 20 Japanese companies scraped together roughly 2 trillion yen to buy Toshiba outright. Delisting it from the Tokyo Stock Exchange after over 7 decades as a public company, here's the gut punch detail that will stay with you. Toshiba was founded in 1875, and it went public in 1949, and that year, 1949, was exactly the company's 74th anniversary of existence. And the year it delisted, 2023, was exactly 74 years after it first listed, 74 years to climb the mountain and reach the peak of global industrial power. Another identical 74 years to slowly, painfully, piece by piece, walk all the way back down. Coincidence? Some coincidences are so perfectly symmetrical, they feel like the universe is scribbling a footnote just for you. So let's go all the way back to the question I opened with. Has Japanese manufacturing actually died? On the surface, you'd say no, Toshiba labels are still lit up in stores. Aqua washing machines are still spinning, sharp televisions are still selling, and those familiar Japanese characters are still printed neatly on the front of the boxes. To the average shopper walking through a Best Buy or Costco, nothing seems to have changed at all. But if you peel back that shiny label and look just a little deeper, the factory keys have changed hands. The patent books have new names on the cover. The brand licenses belong to someone else entirely, and the profits are flowing across the sea to the mainland. The hand that actually makes the strategic decisions, the one that signs off on investments and product roadmaps, is no longer in Tokyo. It's in Qingdao, in Shundao, in Beijing, in Taipei. The name on the front is still that familiar Japanese name, but the people standing behind that name, the ones pulling the real strings, have been completely swapped out. So I'll throw it back to you. Has Japanese manufacturing really died? I am not going to give you a neat, tidy yes or no because it's not that simple. Some industry watchers say it's not dead at all. It just changed owners, got an infusion of cash and discipline, and now it's actually more vibrant and competitive than before. Others say that when a nation's proudest, most iconic industrial names need someone else to keep their lights on and their factories running, then in every way that truly matters, that national industrial spirit has already passed away. It's just still dressed neatly in the clothes it wore in life, walking around like a ghost. I'd rather leave that question hanging in the air for you, for the person watching right now, wherever you are. The next time you walk into a store and pick up an appliance or a TV with a famous Japanese brand on it, will you remember this conversation? Will you find yourself tempted to check that quietly rewritten family registry to see who that name actually belongs to now and where the real power lies? That's it for today's episode. I'll catch you in the next one. Take care and keep your eyes open.